Hi, I'm Mark Ciampach, the author of Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition. In this lecture video, we will talk about Chapter 8, Wireless Network Security. Wireless networks are virtually everywhere today. College campuses, coffee houses, hotels, airports, and even on airplanes themselves. And because they are so common, they also are the favorite target of attackers today. What are the vulnerabilities of wireless networks? And how can these networks be defended and made secure? That will be our topic for Chapter 8.
Chapter 8, Wireless Network Security. Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition. Here are the objectives for this chapter. We want to describe the different types of wireless network attacks. We'll talk about the vulnerabilities in the IEEE 802.11 security protocol. And we'll explain the solutions for securing a wireless network. We'll begin by looking at wireless attacks. Wireless data technologies have revolutionized computer networking as well as how we live, work, and play. It's difficult anymore to think of having a computing device, be it a laptop, a tablet, a pad, a cell phone, whatever, that's not connected so that we can send and receive data. Simply beyond our comprehension to think about having a device that's no longer connected. Now, wireless data networks, as we said, are found virtually everywhere because wireless devices are found virtually everywhere as well. Wireless networks have been the target for attackers and continue to be prime targets. One problem was that early wireless networking standards from the IEEE had vulnerabilities, and changes in wireless network security yielded security today that is comparable to wired networks. That is to say, these early vulnerabilities introduced several problems. However, because of changes in wireless network security, today you can make your wireless network as secure as your wired network. Doesn't take much. However, that's often overlooked by individuals who feel like it's not important, or it's too complicated, or it's beyond their means to do so. Shouldn't be the case. You can and should make your wireless network secure. So, let's look into that. We'll begin by talking about attacks on Bluetooth devices. So let's talk about Bluetooth. Bluetooth is a wireless technology that uses short-range radio frequency, RF, transmissions. It's really designed for ad hoc device pairings. The typical example is a Bluetooth headset, a Bluetooth earpiece that syncs with the Bluetooth in my car so that I can make telephone calls. There are other examples of Bluetooth technology as well for a mouse, for a keyboard, but it seems like syncing a cell phone with a car is the most common Bluetooth application that we hear of today. Bluetooth fits under the category of being a personal area network. This is a designation for data communications over relatively short distances, about 10 feet or less, generally speaking. Here are a variety of Bluetooth products. We mentioned the hands-free car system with a cell phone, but there also are stereo headphones with portable music players. You can have a digital camera synced to a printer that's Bluetooth enabled. We've mentioned mice and keyboard, gaming systems, even sport and fitness, heart rate monitors with a wristwatch or another common Bluetooth application, and even some medical and health applications as well. There are actually two types of Bluetooth network topologies. One's called a piconet, and the other is called a scatternet. Now, when two Bluetooth devices come within range of each other, they automatically connect with one another. One device assumes the role of master and controls the wireless traffic. The other device, called the slave, takes commands from the master. Slave devices that are connected to the PicoNet and are sending transmissions are called active slaves. Slave devices that are not actively participating are called part slaves. Here's a figure that illustrates a Bluetooth PicoNet where we have the master, we have active slaves, and we have part slaves. Now, if I have multiple PicoNets that cover the same area, a Bluetooth device can actually be a member in 2 or more overlaying PicoNets. So a group of PicoNets in which connections exist between different PicoNets is called a scatternet. This figure shows us a scatternet. The Bluetooth device in the very center is part of the Bluetooth PicoNet on the left as well as the Bluetooth PicoNet on the right. So this actually would be called a scatternet. And in it we have both active slaves and part slaves. Now, Bluetooth is subject to some different types of attacks. One is called blue snarfing, believe it or not. Blue snarfing is an attack that accesses unauthorized information from a wireless device through a Bluetooth connection. In a blue snarfing attack, the attacker might copy your email, calendar, contact list, cell phone pictures, or videos simply by connecting to the Bluetooth device that you have in your pocket without your knowledge or without your permission. That's blue snarfing. Blue jacking, on the other hand, is an attack that just sends an unsolicited message to a Bluetooth-enabled device. Now, usually blue jacking involves sending text messages, but you could actually send images and sounds as well. So blue jacking is really kind of on the annoying scale more than simply the harmful scale. No data is actually stolen. As an aside, if you want to prevent blue snarfing, your Bluetooth device, like your cell phone, the Bluetooth capability should be turned off when it's not being used, or it should be set to undiscoverable, which keeps the Bluetooth device, actually the Bluetooth capabilities of the device turned on, yet it can't be detected by another device. We talked about personal area networks, which Bluetooth fits in the category of. We'll move up the scale a little bit and we'll talk about wireless local area networks. The IEEE Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers has long played a significant role in computer networking. It is, in fact, the most influential organization for networking and wireless communications. Interestingly, the IEEE dates as far back as 1884, although it didn't start, obviously, on computer networking that far back, but it started work on computer networking architect standards in the 1980s. Now, the IEEE, I'm sorry, misspoke there. The IEEE in the 1990s began work on standards for a wireless local area network. In fact, it was in 1990 that this work began. The design goal was to have a wireless local area network that could operate at 1 or 2 megabits. It wasn't until 1997, 7 years later, that the IEEE approved the first draft, and it was called IEEE 802.11. As an interesting aside, the 802.11 has some meaning behind it, and we'll get into that a little bit later. However, as we said, the 1 and 2 megabits that was in the original design, although that was okay by 1990 standards, by 1997, when the standard was actually ratified, 1 and 2 megabits was far too slow to actually be useful. So the IEEE immediately began work on higher rate standards. In 1999, the IEEE introduced the the 802.11 amendment, as it was technically called, which added two higher speeds, 5.5 megabits and 11 megabits, to the 802.11 standard. The 802.11b standard, as we said, could transmit up to 11 megabits with devices as much as 375 feet apart, using something called a 2.4 gigahertz range. Now, at the same time, the IEEE also issued another standard with the higher speeds called 802.11a. Now, this standard specifies a maximum speed of 54 megabits, much higher, but it used a different spectrum, the 5 gigahertz spectrum. The success of the 802.11b prompted the IEEE to re-examine the B and A standards and see if they could develop a third intermediate standard, if you would, and that became known as the 802.11g. 802.11g preserved the stable and the widely accepted features of 802.11b, yet increased the data rates to 54 megabits, which is very similar to the 802.11a. So, we had the original 802.11, which was 1 and 2 megabits, far too slow to be used. 802.11b, which had speeds of up to 11 megabits, using the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. 802.11a, much faster speeds at 54 megabits, but it used a different spectrum, 5 gigahertz. And the 802.11g, again, faster speeds, up to 54 megabits, but used some of the widely accepted features of the 802.11b standard. Well, in 2004 rather, IEEE started work on a dramatically new standard, which was going to have increased speed and range and reliability. And this is known as the 802.11n. Now, this standard was actually ratified back in 2009. It has significant improvements. In terms of speed, the theoretical top speed of an 802.11n can be 600 megabits. Now, most 802.11n networks operate at a speed of around 350 to 400 megabits, although the top speed could be as much as 600 megabits, depending on how it's designed and how different things are used. Much faster speeds, however, much faster than the 54 megabits that we've been used to under the 802.11g and A. The coverage area doubles the indoor range and essentially triples the outdoor range. Now, interference, likewise, has been addressed because the 802.11n uses a different frequency to reduce interference. Oftentimes, interference is because other devices are trying to use the same frequency. However, the 802.11n uses the 5 gigahertz spectrum, which is less crowded. And there are some security enhancements as well. In fact, the strongest level of wireless security is required when you use 802.11n. It is not optional, as when you're using some of the other standards. So, there we have a brief overview of the landscape regarding the IEEE 802.11, 802.11b, A, G, N, and if you want to muddy things up, the new IEEE 802.11ac standard will be ratified, and devices will be appearing very soon. Now, the different types of technologies, different types of hardware that's needed for a wireless local area network helps us in our understanding of the attacks on wireless LANs. Now, first of all, if I've got a wireless device, I've got to have a wireless client network interface card adapter. There's the official name for it. Just as I have a NIC card in a wired device, and a patch cable runs from that NIC card to the jack in the wall, that NIC card performs functions regarding allowing me to communicate over the network. The wireless client network interface card adapter, same thing. It likewise has functionality that allows me to connect and use the wireless network. One of the primary differences, however, is there is not an RJ45 jack, but instead I've got an antenna, which is used to send and receive signals. So, my device has to have a wireless client network interface card adapter, obviously. What that adapter communicates with is something known as an access point. An access point is a device that contains an antenna and a radio transmitter, radio receiver, so that it can send and receive wireless signals. It likewise has some bridging software, so it can interface wireless devices to other devices, and it has a wired network interface, so that I can connect this wireless device to a standard wired network. So we begin to see that the access point serves as a base station, if you would, for the wireless network. That wireless devices communicate to the access point, and the access point in turn is connected to the wired network. Here's a figure that illustrates that. If we look closely, we can see that at the very heart of it, we've got our access point, and the laptop computers here with the wireless network interface card adapters communicate with it. Yet this access point in the middle likewise has a wired connection to our wired network, so that we can gain access to the resources on the wired network and out to the internet as well. The access point, as we said, acts as a bridge between the wireless and the wired network, so we can connect to the wired, so it can connect to the wired network by a cable, and we can connect to it through our wireless transmissions. Now, standard access points are what are known as autonomous access points. They're autonomous, that is standalone or independent, because they're separate from other network devices and even other autonomous access points. Now, they're autonomous because they have everything they need built in. Everything they need for authentication and encryption and management, all of that is contained within the access point itself. And for a small office or a home, that's just great. What it also includes may be a firewall, a router, a DHCP server, and some other features. Now, strictly speaking, these things are called residential wireless LAN gateways, but most of the time vendors simply call these things wireless routers or wireless broadband routers or something like that. So, if you have a wireless network at home or in an apartment or in your dorm room, you have something that was sold to you as a wireless router, although technically speaking, it's a residential wireless LAN gateway, but nobody calls it that. Wireless LANs have been the target of attacks, and we can categorize the wireless LAN attacks in one of three buckets, if you would. Discovering the network. There are attacks through the RF spectrum, and there are attacks that involve the access point itself. Now, one of the first steps in attacking a wireless network is to uncover its presence. I got to know the wireless network is there so that I can attack it. At regular intervals, about once every 100 microseconds, the access point sends out a signal. It's called a beacon frame. It announces its presence, and it gives necessary information for any device that wishes to join the wireless network. And this entire process, which we call beaconing, is really an orderly means for wireless devices to establish and maintain communication. Well, what that means is each wireless device is looking for those beacon frames. This is called scanning. So, we have the access point sending out beacon frames, it's beaconing, and we have the wireless devices, like my laptop computer, that is looking for those beacon frames. This is called scanning. Now, attackers will use beaconing to find wireless networks and then record the information about them. And technically, this is known as war driving using war chalking. Here are some of the war driving tools. Because there's really no mechanism to restrict who can receive the beacon frames, an attacker can pick up this beaconing RF transmission and identify the network. So war driving is a process of, as the name implies, searching for wireless signals from an automobile, could be used on foot, but most often from an automobile, using a portable computing device. And these are the tools that would be used if I'm doing war driving, which is simply discovering wireless networks. Got to have my mobile computing device, laptop computer, pad, whatever the case may be. Got to have in that device a wireless NIC adapter. An antenna, of course. Usually I might attach an external antenna if possible so that I can pick up weaker signals. Software for discovery. And sometimes a global positioning system receiver. This is not required, but it does really help pinpoint the location more precisely if I'm going to record this information or share it with other users. Now, in terms of sharing this information with other users, after the signal has been detected, the next step is generally to document and then advertise the location. Now, early wireless LAN users copied a system that actually the hobos used during the Great Depression. The hobos would actually take chalk and they'd have a system that they use that would indicate that this particular house location is friendly, this other is not. So wireless networks were identified by drawing on sidewalks or walls around the area, and that was called war chalking. Today, however, instead of using chalk on sidewalks, information is posted on websites, but there are some of the war chalking symbols that were commonly used. If there's simply that closed circle with a network name above it, it meant that was a closed network, couldn't get in. And you can see about bandwidth being open and bandwidth with encrypted network. But again, these war chalking symbols are rarely used today. Now, there can be attacks, as we said, in terms of discovering the network, which would be war driving. There can be attacks using the RF spectrum as well. And generally, these two attacks in using the RF spectrum would involve using a wireless protocol analyzer and generating interference. Now, just as a wired network traffic can be viewed by a standalone protocol analyzer or on a computer that runs protocol analyzer software, wireless traffic likewise can be captured and decoded to analyze the contents of packets. However, capturing wireless data using network protocol analyzer software requires that the network interface card, the NIC, be in the correct mode, and there are some operating systems that support different modes, but that's kind of another story for us. So, an attacker could pick up wireless transmissions that are out there in the air using wireless protocol analyzer software. Now, by the same token, just as an attacker could pick up those wireless signals, an attacker could inject signals into the air that would cause interference. Now, oftentimes wireless networks have interference and disruptions from other devices that transmit wireless signals. Here's a list of some of those devices that can interfere with a wireless LAN because they transmit at the same frequency. But in this example, we've got an attacker who is actually intentionally pumping noise out there in order to interfere with the wireless communication. It overwhelms the access point so the laptop computer cannot communicate. So there we have an attack that is using the RF spectrum. One type of attack is to cause interference. Another type of attack is to actually pick up that information that's floating out there in the air using my protocol analyzer. Now, a third type of attack category are attacks using access points. Two that we'll talk about are rogue access points and evil twins. Rogue access points are all too common. An employee would like to have a wireless network, let's say, in an employee break room, just for the ease of convenience. However, the IT staff says, no, we can't do that. So what the employee does is they go to their local electronics store, and for $29 or whatever the case is, they buy a cheap wireless LAN router, one of these home devices, if you would. They stick it in the break room and use a patch cable to connect it to a jack, and lo and behold, they've got wireless access. Great. The only problem is it's unauthorized, and it may potentially allow an attacker to likewise pick up the wireless signal and bypass all of the network security configurations that are designed to keep attackers out. Because this rogue access point is set up behind a firewall, it could be opening up the network to attacks. In this figure, we actually see how that occurs. We see that we've got our strong internal network, but someone comes along and they connect a rogue access point. So the attacker's computer, which was blocked, now can easily enter the network through this rogue access point. Another type of attack that can be based on using the access point is something called an evil twin. Now, where the rogue access point is set up by an internal user, an evil twin is an access point that is set up by an attacker. This access point is designed to mimic an authorized access point. So guess what? A user's device will unknowingly connect to the evil twin instead, and attackers can then capture the transmissions from it that were intended for the actual access point. Now, if that weren't bad enough, we've talked about the different types of attacks on wireless local area networks and also wireless personal area networks. If that weren't bad enough, in the original 802.11 protocol, there were vulnerabilities. The committee recognized that wireless transmissions could be vulnerable, so they implemented several wireless security protections, and they left some others to the vendor's discretion. However, these protections that they implemented to try to protect were weak, and thus the protections themselves led to multiple types of attacks. Attacks that could be conducted because the protections were weak. These vulnerabilities, which then spawned attacks, can be divided into three categories. The first is that of MAC address filtering. Now, one way to control who can access a wireless LAN so that only approved users can be accepted is to limit the device's access to the access point. Again, access point is the central base station. So if I limit who can get to the access point wirelessly, I've made it a pretty good defense mechanism to keep out the bad guys, right? Well, maybe so. The 802.11 standard, however, didn't specify how to control access. So virtually all wireless access point vendors chose to use media access control address filtering. A wireless device's MAC address is entered into software that's running on the access point, which is then used to permit or deny a device from gaining access. So that sounds like it's a great solution, that I can, from the access point, enter the MAC address of the devices that I want to allow into the network, and only those devices then can come in. Unfortunately, there are several vulnerabilities in MAC address filtering. First of all, the addresses that are exchanged through the airwaves are in an unencrypted format, so an attacker simply just has to scan and could pick up valid MAC addresses and then could change the MAC address of his or her laptop computer to a valid one and gain access. An attacker also can see the address of an approved device, and said substitute it on his own device. Another weakness of MAC address filtering is you can imagine that if I only have a few devices, it's okay. But imagine if I have to take care of 20 devices or 30 devices. I've got to be entering the MAC addresses of those devices. And what about people who come in and just need access for a day? Well, I've got to find out what their MAC address is and enter it. Managing a large number of MAC addresses for MAC address filtering is a challenge. And here is an example of what might appear in terms of MAC address filtering. Actually, most access points give you the opportunity to do a whitelist or a blacklist, they're called. I can say prevent, that is, only the computers that are listed here can access the network. That is to say, I'm going to keep out only these devices, or I can say permit only, which says only allow in these devices. So I can specifically say keep out these particular devices and let everybody else in, or I can say only let these devices in. Most choose the permit only and list the MAC address. Now, as we said, in a wireless network, each device is listening for information, this beaconing that comes from the access point. And actually, the device has to be authenticated prior to being connected to the wireless LAN. Now, one type of authentication that the 802.11 standard uses is something called open system authentication. A wireless device discovers an AP in the vicinity through its scanning and getting a beacon frame from the access point. Now, the device then sends what's called an association request frame to the access point. Now, this frame carries information about the data rates that the device can support, along with the service set identifier, the SSID of the network that it wants to join. Because here's what happens. This service set identifier, and it can be set to whatever you want. Generally, it's some sort of alphanumeric string from anywhere from 2 to 32 characters. This SSID is what allows the door to be open to the wireless network. If the wireless device, the laptop computer, knows the SSID of the network, it sends it to the access point. Access point compares the SSID it received with the actual. If the two match, wireless device is considered to be authenticated, because it's assumed that the wireless device received the SSID as an approved device. Something like that. Wireless device, the SSID is sent out, device says I want to connect, wireless device says you're connected. So what happens is the SSID is, if you would, broadcast, published out by the access point. Now, this open system authentication is weak because it's really based on one factor. Is there a match of the SSIDs? The attacker only has to figure out a valid SSID then to be authenticated, and there are several ways in which it can do so. It could look for the SSID in a device that's already authenticated, but really the easiest way is actually do nothing, because the access point sends out a beacon frame that has the SSID in it. This transmission from the access point to a wireless device is called an SSID broadcast. Now, for some degree of protection, wireless security devices sometimes encourage users to configure their access points so that the beacon frame that has the SSID is not broadcast out, but instead the user has to enter the SSID manually, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. At first glance, this may be improved security because we're not broadcasting out our SSID. However, in reality, it only provides a very weak degree of security, and it has a lot of limitations. First of all, the SSID can still be easily discovered if it's not contained in beacon frames because it's transmitted in other types of management frames sent out by the access point. So the attacker with a protocol analyzer can still easily find the SSID. If I turn off the SSID, it may prevent users from being able to roam freely from one access point coverage area to another. It's not always possible to conveniently turn off the SSID or turn it off at all. And older versions of Microsoft Windows XP, when they received a signal from a wireless network that's broadcasting in SSID and one that is not broadcasting the SSID, will always connect to the access point that is broadcasting the SSID. And this commonly causes problems. Although these weaknesses are bad, that is to say, this open system authentication, as well as MAC address filtering. Although these weaknesses are bad, the very worst weakness in the 802.11b, A, and G standard was something known as WEP, Wired Equivalent Privacy. Now, WEP is a security protocol designed to ensure that only authorized parties can view wireless transmissions. WEP takes unencrypted plain text and then encrypts it or scrambles it so it cannot be viewed by someone who has a protocol analyzer and just pulls the wireless packets out of the air. WEP relies on what is called a secret key that has to be shared between the wireless client device and the access point. Now, the same secret key has to be entered on the access point and all wireless devices before any transmissions take place, because this key is used in part to encrypt packets that have to be transmitted as well as to decrypt packets. One of the problems, however, with WEP was, first of all, WEP can only use 64-bit or 128-bit length to encrypt. These are relatively short, and this short length makes it fairly easy to break. In the process of WEP, the shared key is designated as the default key and is actually combined with something called the initialization vector, the IV. The IV is a 24-bit value that's used in WEP that changes each time a packet is encrypted. Here's a figure of the encryption process. However, the problem with WEP is that WEP violates the cardinal rule of cryptography. Anything that creates a detectable pattern has to be avoided at all costs, because this pattern can provide to the attacker information about how to break the encryption. Now, the implementation of WEP created a detectable pattern for attackers. Attackers could actually see when duplicate IVs, initialization vectors, started repeating, and that gave them valuable information in breaking the encryption. Now, that resulted in what was called a key stream attack, or an initialization vector attack, where the attacker could identify two packets that came from the same initialization vector, and then they could use something called exclusive OR to discover the plain text. Although the intricacies of WEP are beyond what we are talking about, suffice it to say that once this was discovered, attackers were very easily able to craft tools that would break WEP encryption, initially in about an hour. However, those tools became so sophisticated that today you can break WEP encryption in as few as 5 minutes, depending on several different factors. But it simply illustrates the fact that although WEP was intended to provide security, it was very vulnerable. And individuals who thought that their wireless network was secure, it actually was not when they were using WEP. For quite some time, wireless networks were considered not to be secure at any level. However, that's not truly the case. A unified approach to wireless LAN security was something that was desperately needed. So the IEEE and a group called Wi-Fi Alliance began developing security solutions. The resulting standards today are called 802.11i from IEEE and WPA and WPA2 from the Wi-Fi Alliance. We'll talk about WPA to begin with. This was introduced back in 2003 by the Wi-Fi Alliance. It's really a subset of 802.11i. The goal of WPA was to protect present and address future wireless devices. The key is protect present. WPA, if you would, is kind of a wrapper around the current 802.11a, B, and G devices, so that these devices wouldn't have to be thrown out, but instead we could wrap around what's already there and provide a higher degree of security. WPA's heart and soul is TKIP, the Temporal Key Integrity Protocol. It's used in WPA. It uses a longer 28-bit key than WEP, and one of the keys is it is dynamically generated for each new packet that is going to be transmitted. So WPA has some significant improvements over WEP. Another improvement is something called pre-shared key, PSK. Now, after the access point is configured, the client device has to have the same key value entered, and this key value is shared prior to any communication taking place. Now, what happens with PSK is a passphrase is used to generate an encryption key that has to be entered on each access point and each wireless device. This pre-shared key is not used for encryption, but it serves as the starting point for mathematically generating these encryption keys. So with pre-shared key, as the name implies, we're going to have this key shared among all the wireless devices before we begin any sort of transmitting. However, there are some vulnerabilities in WPA. Key management can be difficult. This key sharing has to be done manually. Keys sometimes have to be changed. Keys may be disclosed to guest users. Primarily, if you're using WPA and you have one of these PSK passphrases of fewer than 20 characters, it is subject to cracking through what's known as a dictionary attack. So there are some vulnerabilities with WPA. WPA2, however, the second generation of WPA, was introduced in 2004, and it's based on the IEEE 802.11i standard. It uses some more sophisticated security, uses something called Advanced Encryption Standard, AES, and WPA2 supports both PSK as well as the IEEE 802.11x authentication. Now, WPA2 uses what's called AES-CCMP encryption. There's much behind the scenes of what goes on with this type of encryption. Suffice it to say that it's very strong, and if we use a passphrase that is lengthy and complicated, it's very unlikely that it could be broken. So AES encryption and decryption, it actually has to be performed in hardware because it is so computationally intensive. Now, the 802.1x authentication was originally for wired networks, and it provides a greater degree of security by implementing our port security, and everything is blocked on a port-by-port basis until the client is authenticated. In the previous chapter, Chapter 7, we talked in detail about 802.1x authentication. It's important that the communication between the supplicant and the authenticator and the authentication server in an 802.1x configuration be secure. So a framework for transporting the authentication protocols is known as the Extensible Authentication Protocol, EAP. Now, EAP is really a framework for transporting authentication protocols. It's not the authentication protocol itself. EAP really defines the format of the messages, and it uses 4 basic packets: request, response, success, and failure. Now, there are some common EAP protocols. One is called LEAP, Lightweight EAP. Another is called PEEP, Protected EAP. In addition, other types of EAPs can be used as well. The Wi-Fi Alliance has actually approved 5 additional EAPs, and others can be added in the future. So when we look at the wireless security solutions, we see that WEP, that is the original security that was vulnerable from the IEEE, encryption used WEP, authentication used shared key, very low security. WPA had kind of a medium level of security, but WPA2 has a very high level of security if it's properly used, of course. Now there are some other wireless security steps we can take if we choose to do so. One is the placement of the antenna. It's always good to locate it near the center of coverage area, and it needs to be placed high on a wall. That reduces any sort of obstructions as well as deter theft. The reason why we want to put it at the center of the coverage area is we want as little of the signal to bleed outside our 4 walls as possible. We also can prevent this bleeding out if our access point has power level controls. Some access points allow us to adjust the power levels. So again, reducing power levels, less signal can reach outsiders. Now, organizations are increasingly concerned about the existence of these rogue access points. So there are more rogue access point discovery tools that help an organization uncover a rogue access point. Security personnel in the IT department can manually audit the airwaves using a wireless protocol analyzer, and they can continually monitor using something called a wireless probe. And there are different types of wireless probes. There are wireless device probes. There are wireless desktop probes. These help to uncover a rogue access point. As we mentioned, there are types of wireless probes. We also, for security, can set up a wireless virtual LAN, a wireless VLAN. This is done again, just as with a VLAN for security purposes. Some organizations set up 2 wireless VLANs. One for employee access, which the employee can see the company's files and database through the network. And a second VLAN might be used for guest access, and they have different SSIDs as well. We've talked about a lot, so let's see if we can summarize. We said that Bluetooth is a wireless technology using short-range RF transmissions. We said the IEEE has multiple wireless LAN standards. A, B, G, N are the 4 that are currently popular today. Attackers can identify the existence of a wireless network through using war driving. WEP relies on a secret key that's shared between the wireless client and the access point. WEP is not secure. Much more secure is WPA, but the best approach is WPA2. They've really become the foundations of wireless security. And there also are additional steps that we can take to protect our wireless network. There we have it for Chapter 8, Wireless Network Security. Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition.